Hey guys, so I get a lot of requests on this page to talk about animes that aren't Naruto, and they usually actually do very well, which is super encouraging to me because there is a lot of anime I love to talk about. And one of those specifically is Demon Slayer. You see, Demon Slayer is my favorite of the new gen animes. I love the animation, the soundtrack, the characters, the fights, all of it. And we've already covered a couple of pretty big things from Demon Slayer, like we've covered all of the upper moons and the Hashiras, but there is one thing that we've left behind, and that is the breathing techniques. And yes, technically I could probably make a video about each of these breathing techniques. That would be 5 or 6 minutes each, but I'm gonna try and explain each breathing technique and how it differs from previous breathing techniques to you in this one video. Before we get into explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. But before we get into any of that, guys, today we have one of our favorite returning sponsors sponsoring the video. That's right, we're talking Skillshare today. Listen, we get a lot of sponsors on this page, but Skillshare resonates with me the most. As somebody who tries to spread information with their YouTube page, Skillshare being a place where people can spread and share information with each other means a lot to me. For those of you who don't know what Skillshare is, let me break it down. Skillshare is essentially an online learning community that gives you access to thousands of inspiring and very informational classes. And these classes are for anybody, people who are just creative or people who want to learn new skills. At the end of the day, all that matters is that you want to invest in yourself and your personal growth. Because who knows where you are in your life right now? Maybe you're looking to level up your own abilities or make a bigger impact in your role at work. Skillshare is a freelancer or an entrepreneur's best friend. You can learn skills that can level up your side hustle or just your main hustle, or skills that could launch you into a completely new career. I know classes like Start Your Creative Career by Sonia Rosala helped me launch into my YouTube career. And maybe there's a class on Skillshare that can help you do the same. Listen, all of our days are filled with endless to-do lists, but very unfrequently on that to-do list do we find time for ourselves. And that's where Skillshare comes in. Classes like the Ultimate Self-Care Playbook by Jonathan Van Ness, one of my favorites, teach you how to tap into self-care and wellness on a daily basis. But enough talking about the classes you can access, let's talk about some of the benefits of Skillshare. Skillshare is ad-free, so you can stay in the zone while you focus on your self-care or your career pivot. There's new premium classes launched every single week, so you're never out of content. And on top of that, if English isn't your first language, there's now subtitles in Spanish, Portuguese, German, and French. So what are you guys waiting for? The first 1,000 people to use the link in my pinned comment and my description get a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. Who knows, if you launch a creative career, one day you could be collabing with me. I'd also like to say that I'm going to be avoiding manga spoilers in this video, so no need to worry. See, usually with a video like this, I would rank them from weakest to strongest. It's what I did with the Hashira, it's what I did with the Upper Moons, the 9 Titans, all of that. But the thing about breathing styles is one is not inherently stronger than the other. It's about how you use it, with the 2 exceptions being sun and moon breathing, probably. Oh, and I forgot, if you guys want more NC Hammer 23 content, guys, please go follow my other YouTube page, NC Gamer 23, where I play video games like Subnautica. I appreciate everyone who's already hopped over there. The growth has been incredible. Back to breathing techniques. We'll end with sun and moon breathing because they are definitely the most powerful, but in the middle, there's not really any way to sort out which should go first. So I'm just gonna go in whatever order I feel like, which means first up, we got flower breathing. Flower breathing has 2 known users, Kane, Shinobu's older sister, and Kanawo. And it's a breathing technique derived from water breathing. See, before we get too deep into any technique, it's a good thing to remind everybody that every single breathing technique is derived from sun breathing. Sun breathing was split into 6 major principles: water, moon, flame, thunder, stone, and wind. And then every other breathing technique is derived from those 6. So once again, flower breathing is derived from water breathing. Flower breathing, and you're gonna get very used to this sentence, is meant to mimic flowers and fruits. Every breathing technique is meant to mimic whatever it's named after. But if I'm being real, I don't really see the connection between flowers and fruits in flower breathing. You see, flower breathing is built around agility and graceful movement. And sure, you can say graceful movement coincides with flowers, but the agility thing is kind of where I get lost. See, flower breathing is also one of the few abilities that actually changes your body. Flame breathing is just you swinging a sword in a specific way, but flower breathing is different. See, flower breathing actually enhances your vision. So anytime that you're fighting, the massive amount of agility you have to use flower breathing is counteracted for yourself with your enhanced eyesight. Well, what do I mean by that? Essentially, these are humans moving incredibly fast, even for Hashira. But their reaction time isn't necessarily faster than your average Hashira. Therefore, by enhancing their eyesight, they are able to adjust to their own speed. And while this boost is ever present every time you use any of the 7 techniques of flower breathing, it it is most present when you use its final form. When you use final form Vermilion Eye of flower breathing, it enhances your vision so much it seems as though the world is moving in slow motion. Top that with the fact that flower breathers are some of the fastest people on Earth, and you have a very dangerous technique. But here's the thing, why isn't everyone using it if it's so good? Well, the use of this final form actually puts an intense strain on your eyes that can damage your eyesight. Think of it a bit like a Mangekyo Sharingan, except it's a bit more like a Byakugan than anything, because the amount of blood that has to get pumped to your eyes, like a Byakugan, bursts the blood vessels in your eyes and can lead to blindness. But this final form makes flower breathing incredibly unique because it is unlike other breathing forms, not just a sword swinging around. So don't sleep on Kanao. Next up, we have love breathing. Love breathing only has one known user, and that's because it was created by Mitsuri. Love breathing is actually derived from flame breathing. We know this because in Rengoku Gaiden, Rengoku's spin-off manga, we see Mitsuri training under Rengoku, but unfortunately, flame breathing doesn't really jive with her. You see, flame breathing is a very stoic practice. It's actually based around kendo, focused on one big large slash attacks. And while that would be advantageous with Mitsuri's strength, she is flexible. She is more flexible than any human ever. So the stoicness of flame breathing doesn't really work with her. So when she's backed into a corner during Rengoku Gaiden, love breathing comes out organically, and she identifies a new way to fight. Love breathing is supposed to emulate love somehow, like it's not an abstract concept. But basically all of the moves in love breathing focus around a short or mid-range attack with a whip Nichiren sword. Yes, Mitsuri's weapon is a whip sword, most likely based off the Urumi from the Indian subcontinent. This breathing style uses flexibility, dexterity, agility, and speed. Mitsuri has the muscular density of 3 sumo wrestlers, and therefore her whip can pack a massive punch very quickly. And Mitsuri's ability to attack at a mid-range that isn't possible for most Hashira actually makes this a very defensive breathing technique. Essentially, this breathing technique is focused on death by 1,000 cuts. Your inability to close the range between you and Mitsuri will leave you cut open a bunch. And once you're weakened, she can decapitate you. But since we're talking about Mitsuri and where she learned this love breathing, let's talk about what she learned it from. Flame breathing. Our only known flame breathers are, well, I guess Mitsuri for a little bit, but mostly Rengoku and his father, aka Kyotaro and Shinjiro. Flame breathing is one of the 6 original techniques, so it's derived directly from sun breathing. And closely, I might add. It's basically just weaker sun breathing. You'll understand why it's weaker sun breathing in a little bit. Flame breathing is another one of those circumstances where I don't think the technique lines up with what it's named after. Like I said earlier, flame breathing is largely built around kendo. Almost every single technique in flame breathing revolves around one strike attacks that burn their opponents. Most of these techniques start from an up high stance, which is where most strikes start from in kendo. Now with flame breathing, it feels appropriate to remind you that none of the effects that we see in Demon Slayer actually happen. The only breathing styles that make the things they're named after are wind and, well, I think just wind. That seems hard to believe when things like flame breathing 5th form exist, because flame breathing 5th form makes a literal tiger. But the thing is, Rengoku is within this tiger, because flame breathing 5th form is actually Rengoku delivering multiple strikes as he closes the distance. If you actually pause the show while this technique is being used, you can see Rengoku inside the tiger. Yes, I could see how you would be confused. It's also confusing because flame breathing 9th form left a scorch mark where Rengoku activated it, but that could just be from the kinetic force of Rengoku launching forward so quickly. But once again, we don't really know. All we know is that there was no actual fire. Technically, I lied. Wind breathing isn't the only thing that makes the thing it's named after. So does sound breathing. Then again, every breathing form makes sound. Sound breathing is derived from lightning breathing, and it is meant to mimic sound, specifically disorienting loudness. Like if 3 different rock bands were playing a show simultaneously. Sound breathing is also very unique as breathing techniques goes. Since it is based off sound, technically the technique is supposed to happen at the speed of sound. In order to simulate sound, users of sound breathing try to move so quickly that they are emulating sound with their speed. It is also highly focused on the user's own sense of hearing. But on top of that, like I said earlier, it's about disorienting your opponent, and that requires a lot of explosives. See, something that's not crazy well fleshed out in the anime, at least, is the fact that every single time Tengen swings his sword, he throws an explosive. In him and Gyotaro's final fight, when you see all of the explosions, Tengen is throwing mini bombs that he is slicing with his sword to explode. And if that's not crazy enough, you don't want to fight Tengen for long. You see, sound breathing would probably be impossible for most people to pull off, outside of maybe Zenitsu, who also has very good hearing. Because while Tengen fights you, he creates something called musical score. Essentially, while fighting you, he deconstructs the way you fight into a rhythm that he writes as a musical score. Essentially, as you go further into the fight, Tengen begins to figure out how you move. And once he has written the song that is your technique, he can see directly through you. Sound breathing can only really be pulled off with Tengen's butcher cleaver-like swords. Nunchucks are known for how fast they can travel. This is because of the centripetal force that's allowed with the chain. With a regular sword, Tengen wouldn't be able to achieve the speed that he needs to slice all the anti-demon bombs he's throwing. But because of the centripetal force and the fact that these cleavers are so massive, a demon has never survived a blow from them until Yotaro. This is why I have so much respect for sound breathing. One, Tengen has to be moving at damn near the speed of sound, but two, he is constantly throwing anti-demon bombs that he is using to slash with his sword to increase the might of his swings. It's a terrifying prospect. But since we're talking about sound breathing, let's talk about the thing that it's derived from, thunder breathing, which has 3 known users: Zenitsu, obviously, Jigoro, the former Thunder Hashira who trained him, and Kaigaku. Kaigaku trained with Zenitsu under Jigoro, and he plays a very important role in the manga later on. Now, thunder breathing is meant to mimic thunder, which has never made sense to me because it more mimics lightning. In fact, it is specifically stated to mimic lightning, so why is it not called lightning breathing? Thunder breathing is all about swift movement and quick strikes that are meant to mimic lightning as it rips through the night sky. Every single form in thunder breathing is revolved around using insane amounts of speed to deliver quick and precise blows. But it is also based around the real-life technique called Iai Jutsu, essentially a sword discipline based around pulling your sword from your hilt in a quick fashion. Think Nobunaga from the Phantom Troop. The technique is achieved, at least by Zenitsu, by funneling all of his strength into his legs. Essentially, by maximizing the output of every single muscle and blood vessel in a thunder breather's legs, you can achieve blinding speeds and can even pivot midair. And I guess where thunder breathing gets its name is that thunder breathers, while poised to do an attack, will actually have the air vibrate around them and can make thunder-like shocks with mere footsteps. Now, thunder breathing actually has 6 total forms. I know we only ever hear first form because that's all Zenitsu could master, even though Zenitsu can do first form 6-fold, 8-fold, and godlike speed. You see, thunder breathing first form is thunderclap and flash, and this technique is where we get our Iai Jutsu. First form 6-fold just means 6 strikes in thunderclap and flash. I'll let you guess what 8-fold means. However, god speed allows the user of thunder breathing to move at an incomprehensibly fast speed. And the first time we see Zenitsu use it, he remarks that he shouldn't use it more than 2 times in a day, otherwise his legs will be rendered useless, meaning that the physical strain it takes for him to push all of his strength into his legs to achieve this speed is taxing. But there's actually 6 other forms of thunder breathing, 5 of which that are used by Kaigaku, and the 7th form, which is the final form, I guess, which is created by Zenitsu, where he dashes forward very quickly and delivers a low blow slice with his sword that creates dragon. It's called 7th form Honai Kazuchi no Kami. The other 5 techniques, all used by Kaigaku, are based around the fact that Kaigaku can make lightning. Not just make it look like he has lightning, his swings are accompanied with lightning strikes. And the way that Kaigaku uses thunder breathing is actually as a long distance technique, launching strikes of lightning from a distance. But we won't go too far into that because anime only people haven't gotten there yet. But since we're talking about creating what your technique is named after, let's talk about the only one that actually truly does it: wind breathing. Wind breathing, like thunder breathing, is directly derived from sun breathing, and it mimics wind, specifically aggressive torrents in whirlwinds. But wind breathing is actually unique in the fact that it has no defensive techniques. Every technique in wind breathing is solely offensive. This is why Tsunemi is covered with so many scars. He knows no defensive techniques. He has strictly enhanced his muscular biology to such a degree that he can close open wounds by flexing. In fact, it is stated that his body is as physically strong as it could ever be. Wind breathing is based off the real-life sword technique Jingen Ryu, which essentially is a sword technique that only focuses on your first strike. It states that a second strike isn't even considered in Jingen Ryu, meaning by the time you swing your first strike, your opponent should be cut down. There are only 2 known users of wind breathing, Sanemi and Masachika, who was Sanemi's partner. And while there's 9 forms of wind breathing, and most of which don't create wind, there is one that does. See, your average wind breathing technique ability is basically just people swinging a sword. One of them swings the sword 4 times so it looks like a claw. That's the second form. The first form requires you dashing at your opponent and continuously swinging your sword horizontally to look like a cyclone. But the true interest comes in forms 7 through 9. The 7th form is called Gale, sudden gusts, where the user jumps into the air and swings their sword, which creates gale force winds that rip their opponent apart. The 8th form is called primary gale slash. This is where the user jumps into the air and creates circular torrents of wind that can slice enemies in half. And the 9th form is Ida 10 typhoon, where the user jumps up into the air and sends gale force winds below them, wiping out anything below them. Essentially, this breathing technique is based off the fact that you have to be insanely strong. With a mere katana, you need to be able to generate gale force slicing winds. And just like flame breathing, most of these techniques are built around one slice attacks because it is based off Jinken Ryu. But there is also a few techniques that require you to keep spinning around in a circle horizontally to be a typhoon. But speaking of typhoons, next up we have water breathing, which is also somehow directly derived from sun breathing, which doesn't seem like you would get from A to B in that situation to me. Water breathing has the most known users with 6. I'm gonna have to read all of them. There's Sakanji, Giyu, Murata, Sabito, Makamo, and Tanjiro. In water breathing, I believe does the best job of emulating the thing it's named after. But that's probably just because water is so adaptable. See, water breathing is meant to mimic water, but specifically the flow, flexibility, and adaptability of water. You see, water can rest, water can crash, water can run, water can stop. Water is the only liquid on this list, and therefore it can be pretty easy to mimic because it's pretty general. But there is one semi-specific rule about water breathing. Almost every single technique requires you to bend your body, arm, or weapon in order to do a flowing attack that is meant to mimic flowing water. And therefore, water breathing is a very fluid technique. Water breathing is the most commonly used technique because it is the easiest to learn. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily all that easy. I mean, there still is 10 techniques you need to learn. But most of these forms are more or less just flowing, bending slashes. Water breathing can also fall into the debate of if they're not making water, how are they doing that? Specifically, the 6th form, whirlpool. Essentially, in this form, the user creates a torrent of air around them that sucks in everything towards them. And if this happens underwater, it enhances the technique and coats the blade of the water breather in water. And then there's 10th form, constant flux, where the user launches a flowing continuous attack that takes the shape of a water dragon. But this is the same as Rengoku's fire tiger. The user is just in there swinging their sword a bunch. There is technically an 11th form to water breathing, but it's specific to Giyu. It's called dead calm. And essentially by stopping all bodily movements and breathing and all of that, the user, only Giyu in this circumstance, can deflect all incoming projectiles with imperceptible speed. But enough of those breathing techniques with a bunch of users. Let's get into the nuanced stuff, like, oh, I don't know, insect breathing. You see, insect breathing is very different from any other form. Outside of the fact that it has the least techniques out of any breathing form with only 4, it is also highly specific to Shinobu. It is also, fun fact, the breathing style furthest from sun breathing. It is derived from flower breathing, which is derived from water breathing, which is derived from sun breathing. But insect breathing is one of those rare breathing techniques that very well emulates what it's named after. Insect breathing is obviously supposed to mimic insects, but specifically lethal stings and the agility and imperceptibility of insects. See, Shinobu is the only Hashira not strong enough to decapitate a demon, even though she can split a boulder in half with a stab. Because of her physical weakness, she had to adapt her fighting style. So instead, she uses a rapier, a thin sword specifically used for stabbing. Almost every single technique, of which there are only 4 in insect breathing, involves thrusting, stabbing, or making shallow cuts with this rapier. There's something else special about this rapier that isn't just the fact that it's stabbing. It's also coated in wisteria poison. Essentially, on the mountain where the demon slayers meet grows a flower, and this flower is called wisteria, and it is poisonous to demons. Shinobu has concocted a liquid poison out of this wisteria flower and uses it to coat her blade, which is why she tries to stab demons as many times as possible, because every time she stabs a demon, more poison is put in their body. The irony of insect breathing, though, is that insect users visualize themselves creating butterflies with their swings, when in reality they attack much more like a bee. See, this technique only works if you are incredibly fast, and Shinobu is the fastest of the Hashira. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to get the amount of cuts necessary to poison in upper rank demons. Doma, upper rank 2, referred to Shinobu as the fastest Hashira he had ever seen, and said that her fourth form, Dance of the Centipede 100-Leg Zigzag, was strong enough to destroy an entire wooden bridge. Essentially, while Shinobu's slashing force may not have been great, and it was actually subpar, her thrusting force was like nothing we've seen. The speed of her dashes is comparable to those of thunder breathing, except faster. But since we're talking about highly specific breathing forms, let's get to our next one, serpent breathing. Serpent breathing is derived from water breathing, somehow. I guess both water and snakes can slither, and also snakes have water in them, but essentially this breathing technique is meant to mimic serpents. Specifically, how serpents slither. Almost every single technique within serpent breathing is dependent on bending or slithering your sword upon contact. And serpent breathing is so big on slithering that Obanai, the only user of it because he created it, uses an Indonesian Kris sword, which is a sword that slithers. Essentially, a Kris sword is all wiggity wavy, and this is done in order to make wounds that are incredibly hard to close. The waves of a Kris sword, if stabbed into you, will come out differently than they went in, making a borderline inoperable wound, essentially making it the perfect assassination weapon. Another big tenet of serpent breathing is the fact that the attacks tend to meander. Unlike flame breathing, which is a straightforward direct attack, serpent breathing meanders around and can attack from anywhere. But there's also another reason that serpent breathing isn't used by anyone else outside of Obanai. It's because Obanai can't use this technique without his snake, Kaburamaru. You see, Kaburamaru and Obanai can speak telepathically. Sort of. They can just communicate. And Kaburamaru can tell Obanai where enemies are, essentially acting as Obanai's eyes, which is good considering the fact that Obanai is actually blind in one of his eyes. And because the snake has extrasensory perception that we don't, this makes Obanai much quicker on his feet than most people. This communication between man and snake is actually so complete that if Obanai can't see at all, he can still fight with the help of Kaburamaru. Essentially, snake breathing is about attacking in unpredictable fashions and using this unpredictability to decapitate your opponent when they least expect it. Unfortunately, that couldn't be further from our next topic, stone breathing. Stone breathing is derived directly from sun breathing, and it mimics earth and stone. And actually, how it mimics earth and stone is probably the most interesting explanation out of any of the breathing techniques. Essentially, every single technique is dependent upon the earth under the user and how the user uses it to generate powerful attacks for either offense or defense. Essentially, imagine a fighting technique where you have to use the power and the weight of the earth to channel into your attacks for either offense or defense. And you could say,
Nick, technically every single breathing technique does that because of gravity.
and you'd be right, but Guillaume is big, and that's about it. Guillaume is the only user of stone breathing we've seen. And since he's the only user of stone breathing, and stone breathing was directly derived from sun breathing, we can assume that somebody taught him stone breathing and he didn't create it. But what we also have to assume is that users of stone breathing have to use an axe and a flail, because that is exactly what Guillaume uses. Guillaume uses a Nichiren iron flail and axe that are attached with a chain. They are made out of pure iron and weigh a lot. But that's not the end of the world, considering the fact that Guillaume is over 7 feet tall and over 300 pounds. Well, I guess technically a flail and an axe aren't necessary. As long as your weapons are massive and connected by chains, you should be good. Because in a flashback, we saw the progenitor of stone breathing using 2 massive Kusarigama type weapons. Truly, the most important thing in stone breathing is the chain, because most of the attacks require you to manipulate either your flail or axe by its chain in order to create a pincer move, or to spin your weapons to crush your enemy into the ground, or to redirect the flail to attack your enemy from behind. Essentially, whatever attached to your chain doesn't necessarily matter as long as you can manipulate them and they're very heavy with said chain. Now, Guillaume is the strongest Ashura, but that doesn't make stone breathing the strongest breathing form. It's mostly the fact that he's over 7 feet and over 300 pounds and cut. But he's also blind, and therefore all perceptions of him aiming at somebody with his chain are done with his hearing, which is said to be as good as Tengen or Zenitsu's. In fact, it's so good he can hear wounds healing. Stone breathing isn't the only breathing style where hearing is important. It's also very important in our next breathing technique, beast breathing. Beast breathing was created almost on accident by Inosuke. It is a derivative of wind breathing, which is why when Inosuke swings his sword, there's that blue-white windish looking after effect. Beast breathing is obviously supposed to mimic beasts, but specifically their unpredictable and ferocious nature. This includes and is not limited to the attacks, movement, and senses of beasts. Almost all of the techniques within beast breathing replicate straightforward, wild, and unpredictable animalistic type attacks. In a sense, they're primal and not refined like something like flame breathing. Almost as important for a reckless regard for your own life to beast breathing is Inosuke's swords, specifically the fact that they are serrated. You see, it's hard to emulate teeth and claws with a clean, straight blade, because teeth and claws do ripping, not slicing. So Inosuke's swords that he bashes in with rocks in order to make a serrated edge are good for ripping through flesh. Inosuke will even go so far, as he does with his 6th form Palisade Bite, where he will use his swords as saw blades to saw through demons' necks, arms, basically anything he wants. But I know what you're saying. This just kind of sounds like Inosuke swings his sword in whatever direction he can get it to go. It doesn't sound truly wild or animalistic. But let me point you towards his 9th fang, aka his 9th technique, Extending Bendy Slash. When, while swinging his sword, Inosuke will dislocate his shoulder in order to increase the range of the slash. But beast breathing goes beyond reckless abandon. Beast breathing 7th fang is the best example of that. Beast breathing 7th form is called spatial awareness, and it's meant to replicate the 6th sense that predators and prey have in the wild. Essentially, Inosuke has hypersensitive touch, meaning that essentially Inosuke can plant both of his swords in the ground, reach his hands to the side, and sense out where his enemies are. This technique is seen to be powerful enough to find every single enemy on an entire mountain and ascertain their weaknesses. And this is all felt through tiny disturbances in the air. And while beast breathing only technically has 11 forms or 11 fangs, there's a secret 12th form, Sudden Throwing Strike, where Inosuke just whips his swords at his enemy. I truly believe beast breathing shouldn't even have forms in order to embrace the wild and unpredictable side of it, but then again, I'm not the one writing the show. But since we're talking about breathing techniques derived from wind breathing, let's talk about the other technique derived from wind breathing, mist breathing. Technically, I believe mist breathing should have been derived from water breathing, but once again, what do I know? Mist breathing only has one known user, Moishiro Takedo, and mist breathing is meant to mimic mist, but specifically the obscurity of mist. You see, mist breathing is about disorienting your opponent. Essentially, you move and attack in a way that is very unique, but also obscures your opponent's vision and perception of the battlefield. That's a bit general, vague, and hard to understand, so let me break it down. Moishiro wears incredibly baggy clothes, and that's not for fashion. You see, the reason he wears incredibly baggy clothes is so his movements are concealed by his clothing. This allows Moishiro to keep his opponents guessing. But in order to keep an opponent guessing, you also have to move incredibly quickly, like insect breathing level quick. And that's why I would say mist breathing is arguably the 2nd fastest breathing form besides insect, because it's hard to conceal a one-strike attack. And this is why mist breathing is centralized on delivering multiple slashes in quick succession. Now, Moishiro is the only person we know who uses mist breathing, but we know he wasn't the person who made it. So we can assume that anybody who wants to deal with mist breathing at the highest level has to don baggy clothes just like him. But just because Moishiro wasn't the person who made mist breathing doesn't mean he didn't reinvent it. See, Moishiro is the creator of the 7th form of mist breathing. 7th form, obscuring clouds. This technique is centralized around Moishiro constantly changing the tempo at which he's moving. Essentially, by constantly changing how fast or how slow he's moving, he throws off the enemy's ability to judge the distance between them and also how fast Moishiro is moving. This disorients the enemy and creates the imagery of clouds surrounding them. Essentially, when Moishiro is approaching the enemy, he will move incredibly slowly, but whenever he's hiding or dashing around the enemy, he moves incredibly quickly. This makes his movements almost impossible to judge and predict. And in essence, it works a little bit like body flicker from Naruto. And while mist breathing is surely intimidating in Moishiro's hands, considering the fact that he became a Hashira in 2 months and is only 14 years old, it's nowhere nearly as intimidating as moon breathing. Moon breathing was created by Kokyo Shibu, aka Upper Moon Number 1. Now, I'm not going to dive deep into Kokyo Shibu's backstory because that is a manga spoiler, but essentially moon breathing is derived from sun breathing because Kokyo Shibu couldn't learn sun breathing. Now, moon breathing is supposed to mimic the moon, and it mimics the moon in a very specific way. First off, moon breathing only mimics a crescent moon. Essentially, all 16 of the moon breathing techniques are just standard sword slashes, but they always take the shape of a crescent moon. But since these techniques are kind of basic sword techniques, moon breathing has incredible offense and defensive coverage. In that sense, it's very similar to sun breathing, because a balanced sword technique is actually very powerful in the Demon Slayer universe. Thunder breathing, wind breathing, and flame breathing are all relatively offensive forward. There is very very little defensive mechanisms built within those breathing techniques. While insect breathing has incredible offensive capability and killing ability, but is too heavily reliant on speed, not strength. Breathing styles like moon and sun breathing have a broad range of capabilities. Sun breathing has 13 techniques, moon breathing has 16. Having this breadth of techniques to pull from allows them to be incredibly balanced and powerful. Moon breathing was created when Kokyoshibu was a human. He had to adapt sun breathing into something he could actually use, and thus moon breathing was created. Then later down the line, Kokyoshibu became a demon, and that's when he enhanced moon breathing even further. You see, Kokyoshibu added his blood demon art to moon breathing. Kokyoshibu's blood demon art is a bit odd. Essentially, when he swings his sword, crescent moon blades swing off of his sword. That's not super well worded, so let me break it down in a way that's easier to understand. Kokyoshibu's sword is made of his own blood, and thus he can extend it, shorten it, or even fix it if it breaks. But because his sword is made of his own blood, whenever he swings it, he can activate his blood demon art. And his blood demon art is a sort of projectile. Essentially, whenever he swings his sword, it creates crescent moon blades that go with the flow of the swing. Imagine every time you swung a katana, kunai flew in the direction that you swung that katana. Except Kokyoshibu doesn't control how large or how many of these crescent moons there is, which makes fighting against this very difficult. Because sometimes if he swings his sword, 7 crescent moons, but small ones will pop out. And now not only do you have to deal with a dude swinging a sword he can extend at will, you also have to dodge the crescent moon blades. But he also could have created 3 really large crescent moons, or 2 big ones and 1 small one. The unpredictable nature of this makes it incredibly hard to counter. Not to mention, this is the upper rank #1 demon who has been practicing swordsmanship for 5 centuries. And oh yeah, he can use total concentration breathing because he was a demon slayer. But he only created that breathing style because he couldn't master the next one on the list: sun breathing. Sun breathing has 4 known users: Yoruichi Tsujikuni, the man who created it; Sumiyoshi, who was Tanjiro's great-great-grandfather; Tanjiro's father; and Tanjiro. Yoruichi Tsujikuni created sun breathing almost on accident. Essentially, one day Yoruichi Tsujikuni picked up a sword and began to spar with his twin brother. His twin brother, who was a much more experienced swordsman than Yoruichi. However, Yoruichi quickly defeated his twin brother, and in the process essentially created sun breathing. You see, Yoruichi was incredibly talented from the get-go, but that is because it was revealed that he was constantly in transparent worlds, meaning that Yoruichi was constantly able to see the blood vessels and muscles of everybody around him, essentially X-ray, which allowed him to see how they were about to swing their sword and predict their movements. And therefore he was able to create an incredibly balanced offense and defensive swordsmanship. Problem was, not everybody is always in transparent worlds, so this is actually incredibly hard to teach other people, which is why none of Yoruichi's students picked it up, except for, of course, Sumiyoshi. Except Sumiyoshi didn't really learn sun breathing, he learned the Hinokami Kagura. You see, the Hinokami Kagura is a dance that was passed down all throughout Tanjiro's lineage. And this dance is comprised of 12 moves, specifically the 12 techniques of sun breathing. Now, the Kamado have been doing this dance to give credence to the fire god. Essentially, the head of the Kamado family at the beginning of every new year would do this dance from night until morning. This was a ritual ceremony to the fire god to ward off bad luck and diseases. But Tanjiro notices as a boy that the breathing technique used during this dance makes it seem as though somebody can dance forever because they never seem to get fatigue. This is because the dance is an optimized set of movements with one specific purpose: kill Muzan. You see, Hinokami Kagura is a repetition of 12 movements, the 12 techniques of sun breathing. Muzan has 12 vital organs, 7 hearts, and 5 brains, which, by the way, he can freely move around his body. By repeating the 12 techniques of sun breathing over and over and over again, you're able to increase your agility and also reduce your fatigue. That is why this dance is passed down through the Kamado lineage, so that it's never forgotten for the day that it's used to kill Muzan. But both sun breathing and Hinokami Kagura are meant to mimic the sun, specifically the unpredictability in the variance of the sun. You see, sun breathing has no set pattern or no set ways. It is incredibly varied and thus is the best breathing technique for killing demons, because its user of sun breathing will never have their patterns read by a demon. The versatility and adaptability of sun breathing makes it second to none. My favorite part about talking about breathing techniques is the fact that sun breathing is truly no more special than thunder breathing, except except in one regard. Sun breathing is diverse. Obviously, something like thunder breathing is essentially only Iai jutsu, but by becoming a master of many different sword techniques, essentially you are able to have such wide coverage that you can establish yourself as an offensive and defensive foe. And that is the true strength of sun breathing. Obviously, you sprinkle in a little transparent world in there as well, it's gonna help. But yeah, guys, that's everything we know about breathing techniques. This was kind of a Spark Notes version of all breathing techniques smushed into one video. But if you guys would like deeper dives on any of the breathing techniques, guys, let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, go ahead and please like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I'm not saying Inosuke is the strongest person in the Demon Slayer universe, but nobody else created a breathing technique with no additional training and nobody helping them.